Hello again, health psych students. I never thought I'd be doing this to my computer this semester. All right, plan for today is to cover diabetes. So let me pull up the PowerPoint. And this is one of those PowerPoints where normally I like to do a lot of drawing on the board. So I have tried to adapt it a bit to make it so that you all can understand what we are covering. Okay, so diabetes. I'm going to define all the different types here in a bit. If I were to clicker question you, diabetes cases in the United States, the answer would be it's increasing both in incidence and prevalence. So number of new cases and existing cases. It's also increasing in younger and older people. So the answer here would be D. Okay, we're going to spend some time. I'd like for you to watch this video clip down here. We're going to spend some time talking about, for those of us who do not have any of the types of diabetes, what is the normal homeostasis that happens in our bodies when we eat, and how we digest, and how we fuel our cells in our body, how we fuel our brain. But if you'll watch the clip first, and then I will get into my explanation here. Okay. So diabetes is really a whole family of diseases that is characterized by this thing called hyperglycemia. Hyper meaning too much, glycemia meaning glucose in the bloodstream. So too much blood glucose or blood sugar in the bloodstream. So when blood glucose levels ride really high, that's what we consider to be a potential form of diabetes. So there's an abnormality in people with diabetes in that normal homeostatic feedback system. And what I want us to do first is talk about normal homeostatic loop and feedback system. And then we will define the types of diabetes by the problems that occur in those in that normal loop, that normal feedback system. So for most of us, if we eat about every 6 hours a day, that normal homeostatic loop takes about 6 hours. And let's take a look at the loop. And again, you all have the video clip from the YouTube a minute ago that you can go back and take a look at. But I'll walk you through this right now. And again, you can rewind if you need to walk through it one more time. Usually when I teach this in class, I kind of look for individuals and ask, do we need to do it again? Do we need to go through it so that everybody can get it? Okay, so imagine we're hungry and we eat food. I just did that a little bit ago. We eat food, the food digests. As it digests and moves into our intestines, the nutrients that are in the food push out into the bloodstream. So glucose pushes out, protein pushes out, fat pushes out if we've consumed that, as well as vitamins and minerals and then that type of thing. Okay, so then after we digest food, glucose, which is our fuel, is released into the bloodstream. So temporarily, glucose levels are going to go up in the bloodstream. The beta cells of our pancreas are going to detect that increase in glucose and then tell the islets of Langerhans cells in the pancreas to release insulin into the bloodstream. So now we've got glucose up in the bloodstream, we've got insulin up in the bloodstream. Now insulin, I want you to imagine, is a transport or a carrier molecule. Insulin can pick up the glucose and then transport it into the cells where the cells use it for energy, ATP or any kind of energy needs that the cells might have. And then all of the cells in our body that are hungry get fed. Now, keep in mind that the brain really prefers to burn glucose relative to other potential cells in the body. The brain's not real favorable over burning other macronutrients like proteins and fats unless the body is starved and then moves into a state of ketosis, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the nutrition lecture. But keep in mind, for most of us, our brains prefer glucose over other macronutrients, meaning our brain's going to be very sensitive to when it has not been fed in a while. Okay, so all of the cells get fed, and then in the bloodstream, since all of the glucose is now out and into the cells, the bloodstream is going to have a lowered amount of blood glucose. Okay, the thalamus part of the brain is going to be able to go, whoa, I haven't eaten in a while, I'm kind of feeling it, my brain's not being fed well enough after enough time. And then that signals to us that we are yet hungry again. And then so we repeat that whole homeostatic cycle. Now, for most of us who don't have diabetes, we just listen to our hunger. We eat, several times a day, and our body just thankfully takes care of all of that stuff without us having to think about it or having to worry about it. With people who have diabetes, it's very different. Okay, so I do want you to watch this. And I want you to realize for most of us, we have this normal homeostasis that keeps us in balance. But for diabetes, that homeostasis is broken. Okay, there are a couple of diagnostic tests. All of these are blood tests that are used, but they kind of convey different meaning. The A1C, the hemoglobin test, is a good blood test to take to get an idea if a person has diabetes and if their diabetes has been well managed or not well managed in the last 3 months. So a good place that this is used is to kind of track diabetes management over time. Or let's say you were passed out and go into an emergency department. They take your blood and your A1C is way out of whack. Then that could mean, oh, first of all, you could be passed out or in a coma because you're in ketoacidosis, which is a really toxic kind of situation that can happen in people with diabetes. But it would tell the ER doctors there that you've got diabetes and it hasn't been well controlled. The fasting plasma glucose test is when you fast overnight and then you go in and they just take a look at what are glucose levels without you having eaten at least overnight. The oral glucose tolerance test is where there are going to be multiple blood draws. And what they do here is you fast overnight, you go in the morning, they take your blood and they look at the fasting blood glucose levels. Then you drink this solution and it's got X amount of sugar in it, X amount so that they know how much should or shouldn't be arriving in your bloodstream. You drink that, there's enough time for that to digest, they draw your blood again, and then they take a look at what is the reaction in the blood glucose levels now that you have fasted, but then you have just fed some pure glucose into the body. I want you to know that there are cutoffs for diabetes and pre-diabetes for each of these tests. This is not a medical class. I don't expect you to remember these numbers, but I do want you to just sort of understand that we're paying more attention to pre-diabetes nowadays and really encouraging people to get screened because of the increasing numbers. Okay, so I don't know if my menu bar shows up for you, so I'm going to move it here for a minute. There's a lot we need to pay attention to in this particular part of this presentation. And what I want to focus on in the beginning is I want you to go and look at euglycemia in the middle. And I want you to see that that blood glucose level of 140 is, for most of us, our normal homeostasis. For most of us, if we have been fasting, say overnight, they draw our blood, they take a look, it's going to be about 80. For normal people, it might ride up to 160. Most of us, what I'm getting at, that normal homeostasis, we ride somewhere between 80 and 160. Okay. Again, you're eating, glucose is going into the bloodstream, it's going out of the bloodstream into the cells, it's going to drop in the bloodstream, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, again, diabetes is defined as levels that are way too high. So if we get up here and we start looking at moderate, severe hypoglycemia, what I want you to be able to know is that if glucose levels ride way too high, that individual can go into a coma and they can die. Because what is happening is all of the glucose is just piling up in the bloodstream, but it's not getting into the brain or any of the cells in the body. And again, the brain's the most sensitive of the entire body. If the brain is not fed for a long enough time, it will go into a coma and that person will die. Okay, flip side of that. So that's riding real high, way past the homeostasis on the high level. But then let's take a look at what's happening down below. We call low blood sugar hypo, too low glycemia. And you can see here that for an individual who gets way too low, it's the same kind of thing. If glucose levels are way too low, then there's no way that the brain can be fed. We can go into a coma and die. So going back to that normal homeostasis, I just want us to focus on that. So most of us are about 60 to 140. If anything goes wrong where those glucose levels can go way up or can go way down, then we can go into a coma and die. Okay. So count your blessings if you don't have diabetes and your glucose levels kind of fluctuate in that normal range. That's a really nice thing that our bodies do for us when we are not sick in any way. Okay. One more thing I want you to pay attention to is that part of the reason why there's so many people out there, particularly with type 2 diabetes, who have hyperglycemia is that most of us individuals, if our glucose levels are riding real high, we don't necessarily sense that in the brain nearly as much as we sense low glucose in the brain. And we think that being able to sense that low blood glucose is an evolutionary adaptation because it's a part of the function that says, hey, I'm hungry. Okay. I'm hungry. Most people, when they have those kinds of symptoms of hypoglycemia, will start to feel not very happy, not having much energy, will start to feel like really groggy, like they're not thinking clearly. And then oftentimes some individuals even get very, very like emotional and primitive. And then eventually in a normal body, if those glucose levels are way too low, then the liver, we're going to get adrenaline and the liver is going to shake out glucagon for us to be able to have some spare energy, but we get that sort of panicky, anxious feeling because that adrenaline is trying to shake out and help us as an emergency tap into some emergency food stores. Okay, so main thing, if you need to review that again, is that normal's good. You could go too high, too low, go into a coma and die. All right, let's define the different types of diabetes right now. Okay, so nowadays we really focus on calling type 1, type 2, and there's even a type 3 on the scene. And I want to define type 1 and type 2, and I'll give you a little bit of background about the older names and then why we're calling it by these newer names. So type 1, which used to be called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, and the mellitus piece to it would mean that you've got glucose spilling over into your urine, which normally is not happening. Normally the glucose is getting digested and metabolized in the body. It's not spilling over into the urine. For those of you who are going to be healthcare providers, modern healthcare providers, count your blessings, because in the old days, doctors really had to taste people's urine, which is gross. They would taste people's urine, and if their urine tasted sugary, which I assume from the smell of urine, it doesn't taste sugary for most people. Never tasted it myself, but that's how they would have to do, what they would have to do to detect that mellitus, which was a sign of the diabetes in the olden days. So it used to be called insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, urine, sugar spilling over the urine. And the insulin-dependent was if the pancreas fails, which is what happens in type 1 diabetes, you've got to inject insulin. You're dependent on it for survival. So type 1 is when there's damage that's caused to the pancreas. That can be a genetic link to that damage. It can be autoimmune, where the body attacks itself, or it could even be infections that could happen anytime in the lifetime. They're more likely to occur infections in childhood or infections in the teen years, which is why we no longer call this juvenile onset. It used to be called juvenile onset, but the problem we've got with this nowadays is we used to see type 1 only in kids and teens, type 2 only in older adults, but now we're seeing type 2 developing in children, so you can have juvenile onset even for type 2. So we tend not to use that term anymore. I had a friend in graduate school, back to the infections. She and all of her little friends, when they were toddlers in their play group, they all got sick at the same time. And whatever infection they acquired, it damaged their pancreases. They all got type 1 diabetes at the same time. You don't hear about that type of thing happening, but that would be an example of this happening from infections. Type 2 diabetes used to be referred to as non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, because this was lifestyle driven, and it was thought it can be controlled with oral medications. But the non-insulin dependent is out of date too, because now there are quite a few people with type 2 diabetes that aren't able to control their blood glucose levels with lifestyle, or they're not able to control it with the oral medications. So they too have to become insulin dependent and have to inject insulin throughout the day. With type 2, it's not necessarily pancreatic failure. It's when the insulin that works as a transport molecule, it's just not functioning right. Okay, it's not shaped correctly. It's not functioning. It's not able to grab the glucose and bring the glucose and drop it off into the cells. So we call that insulin resistance. And one of the best ways actually to make your insulin more efficient and less resistant is exercise. So type 2 diabetes has both genetic and lifestyle components, and it's about 90% of all cases of diabetes are type 2. We've got a lot of people out there undetected, and I don't need you to know raw numbers, but I want to tell you how we know we've got people undetected. They'll do these every now and then. These epidemiological screening studies where, like, let's say they go into Walmart and they invite people to participate in their study, and they ask them if they agree to participate, have you ever been diagnosed with diabetes by your doctor? And let's say you've got all these people that are like, no, I don't think I have diabetes, or I haven't been screened or whatnot. They draw their blood and they find that their those tests that we just talked about a little bit ago indicate that they indeed either have full-blown diabetes or they're pre-diabetic. So those would be cases where those individuals did not know themselves. It was undetected. But then after they get screened, they realize that it's undetected and they get referred for medical care. One of the big risks for type 2 diabetes is called gestational diabetes. And in gestational diabetes, they screen for this with all pregnant women nowadays. I still remember with my first son, I had so much morning sickness, and I had fasted overnight. And then normally the first thing I would do in the mornings when you've got morning sickness is I put like crackers or something in my mouth even before I got up out of bed to try to settle my stomach. And I had to fast overnight. And so then I had to get up and get moving and go to the clinic to get my blood drawn without eating anything. And then I'm a big baby when it comes to getting my blood drawn anyway, so I get queasy with that stuff. So I remember like sitting there, they drew my blood, and then I had to drink this really nasty, sugary drink that has X amount of glucose in it. And it was like, oh, this is not what I want for breakfast, not with morning sickness. And I remember sitting there and I asked the nurse, I was like, what if I lose this? You know, meaning like, what if I have to run to the bathroom and I can't keep this down? And I remember she was just like, well, then you come back tomorrow. And I was like, okay, mine never matter. Keep this in. I just need to, get through this test. Anyways, I was fine. I didn't have gestational diabetes. But it's a good thing that we are regularly screening pregnant women, because a lot of women do develop diabetes during the pregnancy, gestational diabetes. Know that if a woman does develop gestational diabetes during her pregnancy, sometimes after delivery of that baby, the diabetes goes away, it resolves. But even if it goes away for her, she's going to be more at risk for developing type 2 diabetes in her lifetime. But for a lot of women, it develops during pregnancy, it doesn't go away. A woman who has gestational diabetes during pregnancy is automatically considered to be a high-risk pregnancy, and her obstetrician will follow her very closely. These are women that are a lot more likely to have a very large baby because those babies are getting overfed. And normal baby size is about 7.5 pounds. These babies tend to be 9+ pounds. These women are more likely to need a C-section because of those big babies. Remember, we talked about big heads in the pain lecture. And those babies, when mom had gestational diabetes, here's the epigenetic piece to it. Those babies are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes in their lifetime than a baby that is born to a mom that doesn't have gestational diabetes. Type 3 diabetes, this is kind of a new term that is in the medical language nowadays. We know that having diabetes over time ends up creating brain damage, because we've already talked about how sensitive the brain is to normal glucose levels. And type 3 diabetes is the term that is being used for the risk factor linking diabetes to like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. So that's why that's there on that list nowadays. Okay, symptoms. And I want us to think through, I want us to go back to that normal homeostasis and think through why these symptoms are what they are. So number one, excess hunger. You're going to see this very dramatic in type 1, not so much dramatic in type 2, but type 2 diabetes individuals are oftentimes sedentary, obese, and overeating. So added hunger is not necessarily going to correct things there. The excess thirst is incredibly dramatic in the type 1, and you may or may not see this very much in type 2, but what's happening in creating the excess thirst makes a lot of sense with that excessive urine output. If there's way too much glucose in the bloodstream, then the kidneys in the back, kidneys have to start working really, really hard to clean the blood and get that toxic amount of glucose out of the blood. So it's going to spill over into the urine. Again, that's the mellitus. That's why the old-timey doctors had to taste urine. Nowadays, we've got fancy tests for that. And it's going to make that person really extremely thirsty. So let me tell you about Garrett. He's a former student who went on in our graduate program, got his PhD. He developed type 1 diabetes when he was a high schooler, and he talked about how it was over the summer. He was outside, he was working in the heat, doing landscaping. That's what he was doing for his job in the summertime. And he had noticed, like, wow, I'm really drinking a lot, but he had just kind of attributed it to the fact that, like, well, yeah, I'm out in the heat all day, I'm doing manual labor, I'm sweating, it's no wonder that I'm thirstier than normal. But he said on one of his teenage years nights, he got up in the middle of the night and he went into the bathroom, and that he was just pouring water from the sink and drinking it and drinking it and drinking it. And then he had this moment of like, whoa, something's wrong here. He woke his parents up in the middle of the night, told them what was going on. They took him to the emergency department, and thank goodness they did, because he was in crisis. He was in pancreatic failure and he was in crisis, and he would have died within a few days if they had not made a correct diagnosis of type 1 diabetes and then supplied him with insulin. He became insulin dependent, had to inject, that type of thing. The weight loss makes a lot of sense. If we are not getting regular fuel from digestion, and we're not getting that fuel and that energy into the cells, then the body's going to start burning itself. It's going to start burning its own fat. It's going to start burning its own muscle tissue for protein. So fat for fat, muscle for protein, in an attempt to feed the body and feed the brain. And we're going to talk later in the semester a little bit about the ketogenic diet. If we don't have adequate amount of glucose or carb, then our body moves over into burning fat and protein through ketones that are made in the liver. And doing that when you're pretty healthy at a kind of a mild level can actually improve health and help people lose weight, lose body fat. If this is left untreated, however, in a person diagnosed with diabetes, it can send a person into a life-threatening condition called ketoacidosis, which again, brain goes into coma and that person can die. The mood fluctuations make sense. If our brain's really sensitive to getting enough fuel, we're going to have mood fluctuations as a result of our brain not getting fed. And then the fatigue makes sense because our cells aren't getting fueled. We're going to get really tired there. So from an epidemiological perspective, we tend to see quite a few minority groups in the United States at heightened risk. So African, Mexican, Native Americans are going to be at higher risk for that, which kind of begs the need for relevant interventions. I'll be right back. I'm going to get my cookbook. Bryant Terry. Where are you, Bryant Terry? I'm conveniently in the kitchen. What do you know? Okay, so Bryant Terry came and he spoke. The College of Health brought him in a couple of years ago, and he spoke and he gave a cooking demonstration. And here is his cookbook. We have used this and cooked from it quite a bit. He's got some really interesting spice combinations, and he even instructs you how to buy your spices, how to roast them yourselves, how to grind them, and then how to make different combinations for different African spices. And what Bryant Terry is doing is trying to create culturally relevant soul food. Because one of the things that we think happened in our culture, we had African Americans, unfortunately, as slaves, did a lot of the cooking. And so they wanted to cook and using a lot of the vegetables that they had back in their native Africa. And so that's where we get things like collards and okra and stuff like that. But in order for there to be cooking that had enough energy in it, like that stuff doesn't have collards and okra as an example, and carrots, that kind of stuff, just doesn't have a whole lot of energy in it. But if you deep fry anything like chicken, okra, you put pork fat into collards. If you deep fry and add fat to those things, then they hike up their energy, which was very much needed for these slaves who were working manual labor all day long in the home. slaves that were working all day long out in the fields, picking cotton and doing other types of things. And so classic soul food tastes really good, but it is excessively high in fat energy because of our history of these individuals needing massive amounts of energy to do all that manual labor that they were required to do as slaves. So Bryant Terry is an advocate where what he is trying to encourage individuals to do is to learn how to cook soul food. And he is totally vegan, so there's no animal products whatsoever, but does really clever job of combining the spices and how to cook the food in a way that is much healthier, particularly for individuals who really want to keep eating soul food. Okay. We know that about 9.3% of the US population has diabetes now. We've got a lot of individuals, even probably more people out there who have prediabetes, and prediabetes is certainly a risk factor for developing diabetes. So we're taking prediabetes very seriously. 50% increase in risk of early death. Twice the medical costs for people with diabetes than non-diabetes. And this, I want you to realize that we're at 9.3% now. By 2050, because of the projections, this increase in incidence and increase in prevalence, we expect by 2050, 1/3 of the US population will have diabetes. So one of the things that going back to the beginning of the class when we talked about the healthcare system, and especially when we talked about how healthcare gets represented in politics, that makes me really mad, is we don't spend enough time thinking about why the costs are increasing when we've got like pharmaceutical companies driving up costs, when we've got lifestyle behavior driving up costs. We tend to just really focus on getting everybody insured in the United States. And then remember, we talked about we've got this whole insurance company in the middle that has to profit, whereas our sister countries that have universal socialized medicine, they don't have that middle industry there. We're going to see, just based on these numbers right here, our healthcare costs as a culture are going to continue to increase because of this. Unless we figure out from a lifestyle perspective how to get people much healthier to prevent diabetes, or unless we figure out some much more low-cost ways to manage diabetes, we are going to be in trouble. And then I'm going to talk about morbidity, all the horrible illness that happens because of diabetes here in a bit. And here we go. All right. So these are the illnesses. So one of the ways that we can think about, and I want you to imagine glucose as sugar. When you, like if you're cooking with sugar, like let's say we're going to make lollipops. We heat up sugar and we put flavoring in it, maybe some color, and then we've got little lollipop containers, and then we pour it in, pour the liquid sugar in, and then when it reaches room temperature, it solidifies. So, you know, if there's your lollipop as an example. Now keep in mind, our bloodstream keeps us warmer as mammals, much warmer than room temperature. But I want you to think about the fact that if glucose levels, if they're just if the bloodstream is just really crowded with excess glucose, that ends up creating damage in the really teeny tiny micro vascular parts of our circulatory system first. So micro damage happens first, and then macro damage, like blood vessels to our heart and to our brain, that tends to happen a little bit later in diabetes. So we can kind of understand some of the really bad side effects and morbidity when we start thinking about it that way, particularly for people where their diabetes is undetected, or they're not doing the lifestyle change and they're not doing the medications like they should be doing. So retinopathy is the retina is that, that very sensitive layer in the back of our eye. And if we start getting damage to the retina, then we know that diabetes is the #1 reason why people have adult onset blindness. Nephropathy is kidney disease. And remember, we talked about when there's way too much glucose in the bloodstream, the kidneys work over hard and there's more urination, etc. And that is going to take its toll on kidneys. And so diabetes is the #1 reason why people have kidney failure and have to go on kidney dialysis. And kidney dialysis is when they have to go in usually several times a week, hooked up to a blood machine, and the machine cleans their blood. Like for most of us normal people, our kidneys clean our blood. Hearing loss, number one reason why people have adult onset hearing loss. And then neuropathy is when there is damage to the nerves. And this can kind of translate a couple of different ways for people with diabetes. They could either have numbness and not really just be able to feel, or they can have kind of chronic neurological pain. It can kind of go in different ways. But I want to pay a little bit of attention to the foot part of it here. Because one way of thinking about our feet is our feet are the farthest from our heart. So if the heart's the pump for our circulatory system, the feet are going to get less natural blood flow than other parts of our body. And people with diabetes, the one thing that they run into very frequently is if you can feel a problem on your foot, that's a really good thing. Remember, we talked about in the pain lecture, pain is very adaptive. So as an example, one of my sons got a plantar wart on his foot. I had them when I was a teenager. I don't know why they run in the March Clan in the teenage years, but I took him to the local podiatrist, and the podiatrist was easily able to treat his plantar wart. But in the office, in that doctor's office, there are all these pictures of these really, really gross gangrene ulcerative feet that were nasty, because that doctor's office treated a lot of people with diabetes. So like for my son, he came to me and he's like, my foot hurts. And you look at the foot and you're like, oh yeah, it's a nasty plantar wart. We gotta treat that. Or imagine you've got an ingrown toenail and you're like, my foot hurts. Oh, my toe. Oh, look, it's my ingrown toenail. Or let's say you step on a nail when you're out roaming around barefoot, that type of thing. And you step on that nail, you feel it like, oh, I stepped on the nail. You're going to attend to that. And attending to that wound is very, very important. If you've got diabetes and you can't feel your feet, which is why part of the medical regimen is to have them check their feet on a regular basis. If you can't feel that ingrown toenail, you can't feel that plantar wart, you can't feel these ulcers like they're pictured starting on this person's heel. If you can't feel that, it's going to go untreated. If it goes untreated, it's going to get infected. And we call that sepsis, which is why frequently individuals with diabetes have to have a foot amputated, because it becomes infected and then it's growing up their leg, their whole leg amputated because it has been untreated. It's grown from some type of infection in the leg area all the way up the leg, amputated before it gets up into the rest of the body and kills that person. So very sad outcomes. I do want to focus a bit on the impotence part, or the sexual dysfunction. Again, we've talked about sort of these microvascular things and macro. Sexual organs for all of us guys and gals are organs that get very little blood flow on an ordinary basis. But during sexual activity and sexual arousal are capable of being able to house and functionally lots more blood in that area. So the fact that those vessels can be teeny tiny and then really be able to expand makes some sense why people can get damage in their genitals from diabetes. And then the cardiovascular disease, so this is going to increase risk of heart attack, it's going to increase risk of stroke. That's the macrovascular. That's when you're starting to get damage in big blood vessels all over the body over time. And then that diabetic ketoacidosis is that poisonous kind of thing, that poisonous thing that can happen in the brain that can send a person into a coma and death. Okay. Let's plug through this slide and then I will pause this and we'll do a different part. So there's absolutely no final cure for type 1 nor type 2 nor type 3 diabetes. The American Diabetes Association recommends that we get screened every 3 years as adults. They're now even screening children because kids are getting type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Most people who have diabetes have what is called suboptimal control. It is below ideal control. And their average fasting glucose is hovering around a mean of 180 when it should be hovering around a mean of 110. So I want you to absorb this. I want you to realize that most people out there with diagnosable diabetes are not controlling their blood glucose levels very well. So when I talk about tight control, Tight control, if we went back to that glucose chart, tight control would be a person with diabetes where their glucose levels are going way too high or sometimes maybe a little too low. Tight control would be trying to mimic in their medical regimen and their lifestyle behavior, keeping that glucose fluctuating within our normal homeostatic levels, okay? Now, most people out there are not engaging in tight control. It's very loose control where their glucose levels are riding way too high. And so because of that, for everybody with diabetes, behavior is absolutely critical. This is one of the biggest issues in the whole area of health psychology, as an example. So I want to talk about the diabetes randomized controlled trial that showed if people were able to have tight control and keep their mean down at 150 versus individuals that were riding around a mean of 200, those individuals had a 25% decrease in the microvascular complications. And remember, the micro happens first. There was also a trend for decrease in the macrovascular. So what that means is people out there, the more that we can help them get tight control and keep that mean glucose level down lower, we know that prevents the morbidity, okay? That prevents the illness. In another randomized controlled trial, the Diabetes Prevention Program, they found that just using 7% weight loss. Now keep in mind, for a person with diabetes to lose 7% of their weight, they usually have to begin exercising, make dramatic changes in their diet for their body to lose 7% of its body weight. Ideally, most of that's fat. There's probably a little bit of muscle weight in that too. They found that a 7% weight loss, if they could help these individuals who are randomized in different groups in this trial lose 7% of their weight, they had a 58% decrease in developing diabetes. So incidence, remember, is new cases. So this is a prevention study. 58% decrease with 7% weight loss. Pretty strong. Using metformin, which is an oral medication that lowers glucose levels, in that same study, if they were randomized to that group, they had a 31% decrease. So now they're taking diabetes medication to prevent it from developing. They also had a 31% decrease. But I really want you to pay attention to, yeah, that's powerful. And if you've got prediabetes, going on metformin is probably a great idea. But that lifestyle change is going to have the most dramatic effect in reducing weight loss and preventing diabetes from developing. Okay, this is going to be the end to part 1. I'm going to go ahead and pause and load the video, and then I'll be back to do part 2.